name is Alicia Marie. I am the founder and managing director of PeopleBiz. PeopleBiz is a consulting, training, and coaching organization that offers all types of programs for both personal and professional growth. Often when I'm working with managers, leaders, supervisors, or even when a human resources director is trying to explain to me what's happening in their environment, I hear the words, they're not being accountable. They're not being accountable. So let's talk about why. Why is that? First of all, it's a loaded word. When you hear the word accountability, most of us, and you need to remember this, that your people are actually hearing consequences, burden, blame, judgment, responsibility, stuck, punishment. One time I was leading a seminar and we were talking about accountability, and I actually heard someone say, well, what we say in our meetings is, who are we going to throw under the bus for that? So there's this whole interpretation that your people, that you're wanting to have be accountable, there's what they hear when they hear the word accountability. So let's talk about some actual definitions for accountability. First of all, accountability implies that there's another person. So you really can't be accountable to yourself. You can be responsible for yourself, but you can't be accountable for yourself. Accountability is a state of responsiveness to others, a state of responsiveness to others, to be called on to render an account, answerable or bound to give an explanation. Here's one that I love that I used to use with my sales coach: to count and feedback. To count and feedback. Accountability, when you're really in an accountability conversation, there's no judgment, there's no blame, and there's no burden. You're in a conversation around what that person has agreed to be in communication about, and maybe even some things that they haven't agreed to yet that it's time to talk about. So it's not to be confused with blame or culpability. It's also an attitude. To be accountable is an attitude because it's intrinsic. There's no way to get out of accountability. We're accountable to the IRS, we're accountable to our peers, we're accountable to our employees, we're accountable to our clients and customers. It's intrinsic. We're accountable to our industry, we're accountable to our families. We are asked to give an account for ourselves in society. It is intrinsic. And rather than a negative force, when people really embrace what accountability is, we've discovered that it is extremely empowering to be accountable. Imagine being able to account for, here's what I did, here's the way it is, here's what I've been in action on, here's what I didn't do, and have no judgment or blame around that conversation. It's empowering. An environment of accountability produces problem solving, vigilant problem solving, and communication beyond what you can imagine. And it really starts with you. I want you to think about what you're not being accountable for. So for myself, as managing director of PeopleBiz, I'm actually the one who needs to focus on being the most accountable, right? I'm accountable. It's my job to say, this is how the business is going. Here's what we're doing with revenue. Here's the direction we're going. Here's our strategy this next quarter. Here's what's not working and what we're doing about it. Here's what you can expect over the next week around the database. Whatever it is I am actually the most accountable person in our organization, except that leaders have this complaint that their employees aren't being accountable. Well, take a moment. Are you being accountable? Where could you start being accountable? What could you start communicating and feeding back to your people? So the issue with accountability is not that it's absent. It's always there. It's intrinsic. The issue is, one, how we see it. And so because of that, we avoid it. We kind of create silent agreements with people to not talk about it. And we then ignore appropriate communication when it's timely and when accountability truly needs to happen. So that's the first thing we do. The second is, we don't really set up our environment so that we can be accountable. There's maybe a lack of strategy, a lack of training, a lack of process, a lack of systems. Maybe you don't have someone to be accountable to at home, or maybe what's missing is that there's some accountability needed to a personal trainer or your next door neighbor who you might be walking with if you have a particular goal there. So it's usually a lack of structure and systems that would support accountability. So again, there are two issues. One is because we think of accountability as burden and blame, we avoid it and don't have those timely conversations. And secondly, we don't set up our environments to be accountable. I find it striking when I will ask a manager or a leader, well, tell me what you have in place so that they can be accountable for what they're responsible for. And they will often say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, how do they let you know what they did this week? Or how do they let you know how that project's going? Well, usually I have to call them and tell them. Well, maybe there's a tool or a system you could put in place that would allow for them to be accountable without you having to micromanage them. Oh, so what I want you to think about is you could have daily reports, weekly reports, monthly reports, or some kind of agreement and tool that supports the people around you in being accountable. So to take this back home, one of the number one things that people, that married couples fight about is money. Isn't that interesting? Money. And when you bring accountability home to money, what if you could just sit down with your spouse and count and feed back, and count and feed back, and be willing to have any conversation around what's being spent and what's being brought in with no blame or judgment. What's possible when you become accountable is you naturally start to set up an environment of accountability. Usually I'll have one or two conversations with someone in coaching around accountability, and they realize that they need to go and start being accountable. So they set that up, and what they discover is, oh, now that I'm being accountable, I'm so much more willing to have the hard conversations with my employees. I'm so much more willing to say, well, wait a minute, what was your goal? Well, how's this going? What's stopping you? Well, what could you do instead? What do you need to learn? What will be different this week than from last week? You start being willing to have those hard conversations. To move yourself into an environment of accountability, be accountable.